Okay, well, good morning again. And I'm really happy that David Hawksworth is willing to give an interview. Uh, Let me start, David. Can you tell something about which schools you visit and how you came to pick mycology?
Well, mycology was just by accident.
By accident.
I used to do a lot of field work. I got interested in plants and so on. And found plants were rather easy, actually, and a bit boring. There were books, you could identify them. There wasn't a problem. I used to go on field courses, and the tutors never knew what all these lichen things were. And on one particular, I got very bored, and I found a French book on lichen in the library at a field centre and read it in French. And thought, these are fascinating things. So I started to get an amateur interest in those. But there's no job in that sort of area. You never get a job looking at lichens. And I was at the University of Leicester, and one of the things they're very famous there for is paleoecology, doing pollen analysis on peat deposits. And so my undergraduate project was on peat in the Shetland Islands and looking at vegetation history and so on. And so my first publications are about that. And I was supposed to get a research assistantship for a PhD. And the person that always had these from Natural Environment Research Council, always had one. I was definitely going to get this. Then the professor came in and said, Winifred's not got the grant. But if we write a grant proposal this afternoon, we might get it funded. So I thought, what can we do a grant on? I knew a particular group of lichens was a real problem taxonomically, so I suggested this, and we wrote this project in an afternoon, and we got the grant. So then there was another problem. You're partway through your PhD. How are you going to get a job? Because the only professional lichen people in Britain were in the 30s at that time at the Natural History Museum. And then a post came up at Kew, at the Mycological Institute. And I didn't know anything about other fungi, but I knew they had a lichenologist, partly a lichenologist there at one stage. And so I would give it a go. And so I applied. And at that time it was very strange because it was an intergovernmental organisation, and you were appointed by scientific liaison officers for different countries, but unofficially they did things in a very informal way. And I was taken around and informally and interviewed and things. And then I heard Martin Ellis say to Colin Booth, that was taking me out, "He'll do." So I thought something might happen in due course, and time went on and so on, and eventually I was officially interviewed at the Indian High Commission and so on, and asked questions like, do you think these computers are a good thing? And I'd done some numerical taxonomy actually at the time, so I was okay with that. And so anyway, so I said, what do I? So I got the job at the institute. And I didn't know anything about non-lichen fungi, basically. And then Colin Booth said, well, before you come, read Dennis's British Ascomycetes. Then when you arrive, you find that you have to deal with all the unidentifieds that come in of all groups and send them to the right mycologists. So you see a lot of fungi very quickly from all parts of the world. And basically, so the things developed from there. What I didn't know, there was a secret agenda. Because you've probably heard of Dr. Ainsworth, Geoffrey Ainsworth. Well, he wanted to get lichens in the Dictionary of the Fungi and the Index of Fungi. And lo, he'd just stepped down as director. He'd obviously told the new director of the Institute, you need a lichen person. And so there was a slightly hidden agenda. So having just joined the Institute, I find I was working on the lichen entries for the 1971 Dictionary of the Fungi. And of course we started putting them in the Index of Fungi, and that's 1970. Yeah. So that was going on as well.
If I look in your career, you have done taxonomy, you have done lichenology, nomenclature, you did a lot of editing. What is your favorite field to do? Or what do you want to do, in fact, if
well, I think the interesting thing is that I get a bit bored with things. And I like to find and explore different things that haven't really been done before, I guess, because when I started doing lichen work, this was just as people were using chemical data in taxonomy, for example. So I was the first person, I think, in Britain that tried to do thin layer chromatography at a time when you had to make your own plates and all this sort of thing. This was very exciting because you find new things out. It was very exciting when we realised that you could link the lichen populations to sulfur dioxide air pollution levels, and this started a whole new industry really in lichen monitoring. And then because I was interested in lichens, I got fascinated by the fungi that grow on them, which have hardly been studied, and all the literature was in strange languages like German and French and obscure publications. So I did a key to those in Britain initially in English and found lots and lots of things that were new. And incredibly so. I mean, in Britain now we know there's about 500 fungi that obligately occur on lichens, and that number has gone up incredibly because it was less than I think about 150 initially when I started studying them. And so I think, promoting things really, and new ideas, new approaches to classification. So we did with the outline of the Ascomycetes involving the scientific community. So I guess I like to get things started and see them develop.
Did you get bored when you are doing that?
Well, the only reason I got involved as an institute director, I was at the institute and doing monographs and things and identifying things, describing new genera, describing new species. I'm not going to do this for another 40 years, have I?
So, do you still think that taxonomy is important then?
Well, it's absolutely vital, yes.
It's vital, but
Yeah.
you're not interested in it.
No, I was just going to say I get bored with different things, and I was a bit of a troublemaker, I suppose, but partly while I'm involved in local politics and things these days. And I represented and helped get the institute unionised and things. And one of the outcomes of this, I had a very strange situation where the head of the overall organisation that ran 14 different units around the country dealing with different areas of applied biology, they wanted me to be the secretary of the whole organisation. I was relatively young then. And this has caused great confusion at the institute because I was this sort of junior, mycologist, and I was quite surprised. I never thought of being a manager at all. And then I was Colin Booth said, "Well, the trouble is, most people that go into administration and so on, they don't actually understand the subjects properly, and we need more scientists involved." And that really was the thing that did that, and so it was very satisfying to have this central role initially, and then later come back as director of the institute, where we were in a position to actually develop new buildings and develop what was a very small operation to what became a very big one, which in the end was its big problem. It was too successful. That's another story.
Yeah. Well. You have an extensive list of publications, over 60 books and I think 600 publications and so on. Are there any publications you think are having a big impact in mycology?
Well, I suppose the ones that are most cited are the things on species numbers.
Species numbers. So if you look to species numbers, you had a wonderful paper with Robert Looking, and I think that that paper is really estimating the numbers of fungi. Do you think that these numbers are going to change when there are maybe new methods or new fields to find other taxa and so on?
Well, I think they will do, but I mean they've not changed that much in a way, because when I got involved in this game, because I was actually asked by the US Academy of Sciences to make some estimates of these, and that led to the paper eventually published in 1991. But in that I made clear various things that we'd not studied that we needed more data on, and we foresaw then a lot of the things like cryptic speciation was just starting to be discovered then, but on a biological basis, incompatibility things and so on, and habitats that we knew hadn't been properly examined, which is why the 1.5 million was said to be very conservative at that time. And of course, with the data that's come on since, with molecular data, we've been able to refine those upward figures more.
But still, I believe when you estimate fungi, taxonomy is extremely important.
Well, taxonomy is the whole business of putting names on things is about communicating.
But is it not frustrating that there are not so many mycologists who are doing taxonomy, including you?
Well, I'm still describing new genera and species, but yeah, one of the problems is that there's a big problem that most fungi are not sequenced, that are already named, and people tend to forget this, and there's a big problem if somebody collects something and brings it into a lab. Okay, you can sequence it, it'll come out as compared unknown sequence X, it might be in a particular family or whatever. But so many things are brought in, and people, unless you know the morphology, you're not going to be able to link that to a name. And this is a big problem, and it's an increasing problem because fewer and fewer people actually are able to recognise things. And I'm a bit unusual in that I've looked at lots of things over the years in different capacities. When I was doing things at the Institute, I edited the bibliography of systematic mycology for many, many years, and that meant I saw every paper in fungal systematics in all groups for about 10, 15 years. You see an awful lot of pictures of different fungi. And of course that became very important when I got involved with forensic work with my wife, because I could look at spores and say, oh, that's probably so-and-so. And so again, that's an interesting area which I've got started, I suppose, and that's what I like doing, seeing there's an area that is interesting that nobody's doing much about, and starting to get it going, really.
Yeah. Well, I also believe, I'm myself a taxonomist, that you can work on taxonomy, but where are you going to publish it? Do you have any idea?
Well, for many places you could publish
well,
it. It's not a problem these days.
Well, the problem is that at the moment, if you do not have too much money, you cannot publish because you have to pay for all your papers, even up to $1,500. Mm-hmm. I think that is something what is really a handicap for taxonomy, don't you think so?
Oh, yes, very much so, yes. But there are journals where you don't have to do that.
Give me names, because I think that a lot of people here in the audience are screaming for publications and opportunities to publish papers. Yeah.
Well, I think that the situation is changing for individual species, because there are opportunities like things like Fungal Planet and so on, where you can actually do this now if you've got sequence data. It's more difficult if you haven't, but there are plenty of journals around that don't charge, on society journals and this sort of thing.
But the problem is that, of course, the student or the researchers want to have an impact paper.
Ah, well.
And when you have an impact paper, you have to pay. So,
well, not necessarily.
In fact, you have to pay for the impact instead of the research, which I think is not very good.
Well, I think it's a very unsatisfactory system, personally, but the whole impact factor thing was badly conceived when I was involved with CAB and its journals, and we had contact with Eugene Garfield that developed the impact factor system, and he never actually foresaw it being used in this way. It was a way of helping libraries decide which journals to subscribe to and which journals they should actually cover in biological abstracts and this sort of thing. It wasn't supposed to be looking at the quality of papers or whatever. I think it's a very unfortunate situation, because the impact factor doesn't relate to the quality of any particular paper. And journals like Nature, they have high impact factors because they have a few papers that get vast numbers of citations. A lot of Nature papers don't get many citations at all. They're so specialised. So I think the whole thing is skewed. It's much more important to have an indicator that's based on citations of particular papers, I think, than impact factors. That's the way the world goes, I'm afraid, if people follow a particular fashion, and it's very difficult to break out of that.
Yeah, you're editor of the IMA Fungus, and I remember when it started, it was in fact meant for all the members of the IMA.
That's right, yeah.
Where they had a chance to publish papers. Now, of course, it becomes very professional. Can you say something about the future of IMA Fungus?
Well, it's under discussion at the moment, but one of the problems is that needs to have a more involve a commercial publisher, and that will be decided hopefully at the IMA Council meeting on Friday, I think it is, isn't it? Friday. So
if IMA Fungus is becoming or picking a professional publisher, it means that all the papers are charging for...
Well, there will be some flexibility in that and some categories that will be waived.
But what would you recommend then somebody who, on an underdeveloped country who has really very good taxonomic study who want to publish, where should he go then?
Well, if they're from a developing country, for some big publishers, they automatically waive the charges.
Is it? Okay. Well, that's a very good...
I mean, one of the publishers we've been dealing with, which may or may not be one that's selected, I suspect not, they have a committee that looks at all these issues as they come through.
I'd like to discuss a little bit about your work in nomenclature. I think that naming of fungi, particularly when you are applied science like me, it's extremely difficult to explain why there are always changes in names of fungi and why mycologists, in fact, are not taking care of the, let's say, the user of, let's say, for identification and so on. What is your opinion about naming of fungi? Because you know, I just read an email just last week. You're the last of the Mohicans in nomenclature. So there are probably not very many specialists in nomenclature left, and I'm a little bit worried that that naming of fungi is becoming maybe not so relevant anymore. But that's my personal opinion. What do you think?
Well, I think we've one of the reasons I got involved with nomenclature is that what was available in the 1970s was a very adequate document for mycology. So we've actually tried to simplify things over the years, and we now have a much simpler system because of what we've actually modified with the rules to the extent that now we're here at this Congress, we can actually change the rules ourselves to suit us that relate only to fungi. And so, because we have the registration of names, we have the English we've got in, we've got rid of the pleomorphic dual naming system and so on, we've simplified the starting points and whatever. We've made it simpler for mycologists actually. The problem really is dealing with a lot of the historical stuff, and most of the rules in nomenclature now relate to the history rather than the things that people have to do now, because we have a rather streamlined system for what you want to do now. So I think it's actually a lot easier, but there will be this backlog. But the other big thing we introduced, which is only starting to be taken up and is only possible in mycology, is have these huge lists of protected names. Now you needn't bother about a lot of the last things, like what's in the past. What I'd like to see happen is to get the generic name lists for all groups protected, because there are about, I think the number's about 7,000 generic names that we actually use. There's about another 10,000 in the literature that people could dig up and resurrect and upset things. And we could, by the proposals that we've got, it wouldn't invalidate those names, but they couldn't be used to compete with any that are in use now. Yeah. And so...
what do you think about the impact of the community itself? Because particularly in nomenclature, you see that names are proposed or protected and so on, but the community, they say, what the heck, I'm using this name. We have seen this with Aspergillus Netherlands. Now it's Aspergillus Netherlands. Aspergillus oryz is another example. If you look and do it, your taxonomy, you say it's a flavus, but nobody would accept that flavors for those people who were working in fermentation and so on. So how can we explain to biotechnologists or medical mycologists, all these people who are in the applied field, that naming is important, but also that we listen to these people? And I think that a lot of mycologists, and particularly nomenclaturists, are very dogmatic and think we should, try to convince them, but I think there is no conviction anymore. You cannot change Aspergillus fumigatus for a medical mycologist. He will not change any names because he knows what Aspergillus fumigatus is. So I see that in your work there is some feeling for this problem. Do you think also that this is important, that the community itself will decide what nomenclature is used?
Well, you're missing you're talking about taxonomy and you're talking about nomenclature. These are different things
Yeah,
altogether.
but it's about the naming.
Well, I mean, what happens in some areas is that there is a group that recommends a particular taxonomy, and this happens with the flowering plants. For example, now at the higher taxa, they have an international group that they produce their classification, which pretty well everybody follows. But you're free to use whatever name you want for things. There's no dictation that's your personal opinion on a taxonomic point of view.
Yeah, but I think that doesn't help an applied scientist. I think they want also, and also when you submit a paper, I used the wrong name according to the editor. What then?
Well, the editor needs educating.
Well, yeah, I think that is a problem that we should explain more to applied scientists what naming is and how important it is.
Well, we tried to do this when we've set up the International Commission on the Taxonomy of Fungi to deal with the taxonomy. There's another thing that was quite nice to be involved in starting. One of the things that we started to do there was to actually publish notes on why names changed in a journal that went to applied mycologists. And it would be quite nice if something like that was available on the web or whatever, so people could understand. And it's very interesting in name changes, because if you look at the fields, different fields of science, I did a little study on this at one stage, the take-up of name changes is very different in different groups. And if there's a good reason for it, it will get adopted very quickly in certain communities, and the medical mycologists are a good example of that. And if you actually track in the literature citations of names after a change is made, and I did a little bit of that on a few trials in different groups of organisms, and if things are explained properly and that's disseminated to the community, then things do get taken up more quickly. What is very destabilising is when there are competing classifications being put out and people don't know what to do, and this is particularly a problem with higher taxa. So what we used to do with the dictionary of the fungi was to come up with a system that was probably not entirely cutting edge, but a big improvement on the last edition, but recognising that would hopefully be something that would be a framework for about the next 10 years or so, because that's what people want in the textbooks. You can't keep coming out with new filer and expecting everybody to accept them straight away. It won't work.
Yeah. Well, you're retired for several years and you're still very active. What do you think what you should do in the next years? Is there anything, because you said I'm getting bored of taxonomy and Escomycete, and I found out that you're a council member of the Mole Valley district in England. So that's also politics, local politics. So where are you going from here?
Well, I'm very involved in local politics. I'm part of the cabinet now. I'm responsible for a lot of areas in the district. There's 86,000 people in it, so which is quite a job. And my wife is also on the cabinet of the council, so it takes a lot of time. But no, I think what I would like to see is some of these bigger initiatives on lists of names go through now.
It's very important. Yes.
And of course, I'm always helping people with different things. And Lynn was saying about editing things, and things that I've been through all the reviewers and whatever, and the changes, and they come to me that they've totally screwed up some nomenclatural thing. I mean, the number of papers I get, and they found there's something fundamentally wrong in the type species and things. And there's a problem with the slide that Wilhelm showed on the type of Ophiostoma, which seems to have been overlooked, and saying that a particular specimen was the type, and I saw from his slide there was this small print underneath. So I like to help people get things done. Basically, I spend a lot of time helping people, advising them on nomenclatural things and so on.
So we are extremely happy that you're still on. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes?
Dave,
Scott?
looking back on your career to this point, what's the thing within your professional career that gives you the most pride or joy? And also, what is the one career thing that you've done that you have the most regrets for?
I didn't dare to ask that. So.
I think one of the things that was most satisfying is the fact that we've got which we've not mentioned, that the lichenized fungi integrated with the rest of the fungi. That's the thing we started in the dictionary of the fungi. I got hate mail from mycologists and lichenologists when the 1971 edition of the fungi came out. What have these things got to do with fungi? And now that it's understood that lichen is an ecosystem, lichens don't have names, the fungus have names. The misconceptions still go around, but people don't understand this. What you see is actually a fungus being expressing its ecology, and with different organisms all mixed in. So I think that's probably the most satisfying things actually. And we've now eliminated them from the code, apart from just specifying that the names of given to lichens refer to the fungal partner. So I think that's been a very satisfying achievement, because I became very aware working at lichenicolous things, the same genus could have things in with the different biologies. So it made a nonsense to try and separate these things as they had been traditionally. There are about 30 genera now, which include lichenized species and ones with other biologies, which people don't always realise when they have these arguments about what a lichen is. And this is one of the silly things with some of the exceptions in the code, because you'd have a single genus, some species in that had some rules, other species had different rules. And it's bizarre. And regretting, I suppose, not having known what I know now about all sorts of things. And people ask you for reprints of things that you produced in the 1960s and 90s. They don't want to know that. God, that looks awful. I never wrote that, did I?
So you have regretting some of your publications.
Well, I mean,
Well, sometimes
yes.
it's your relative, because it
Yeah.
was written in that time. I have the same. I've written papers. I thought when I read this, I said, "Whoa, how could I?" But now, but that's.
well, yeah. Well, yes, I mean, from that point of view, yes.
Okay.
So no, well, yes, just regretting as I couldn't have used techniques. I mean, what's been wonderful is to see different techniques coming along. You know, it's so exciting when we started to do chemical work with lichens, and we started to do scanning electron microscopy. I was the first person that used scanning electron microscopy in lichen systematics in the 60s. And you know, it's really tremendous. And I started the DNA lab, of course, at the Institute when that was starting in the 1990s. When we saw this was a good, Alzheimer's before that we started. So I like seeing, getting things started and developed and seeing how they grow, really. But I just regret not being involved in most of these and having these techniques when I was young, because I would have made fewer what we now know are mistakes, because we have the molecular data that we didn't have then.
Okay. Thank you very much for this interview. You have another question.
Yeah, you mentioned registration of names. And when I was trying to find the Stebbins interview online, which I couldn't ever find, I noticed that at that Botanical Congress in 1999...
Oh, well, this was very silly, yeah, that's
one
right.
of the things that came up was registration of plant names.
Well, it's for all groups, and that was the thing we started actually at my institute. That went back for meetings that we held, because I'm interested in bionomenclature in all groups of organisms, and we started this debate. Very detailed proposal worked out. The Americans were so reactionary, they didn't accept it, and this has set botanical nomenclature back decades. All they did in Shenzhen, they're forming another committee to look at this, to report in 2023, so it wouldn't come into effect in 2026, even if they could develop a system. But in mycology, we started it regardless after the 1990s. We didn't accept it. And so we're been up and running, and we're way ahead.
Are the plant names registered at all today, or not?
Well, they are through IBNI. There is an organisation that does it, but it's they're not indexed. Sorry, they're catalogued. They're not registered.
Yeah.
The author doesn't do anything.
Yeah. So it took many years.
Well, it was set back. That was a stupid decision at the Congress. I must say the Americans are very backward, No, one of the reasons is the big institutions in America have these institutional votes, and so an individual can carry 15 votes, okay, by collecting them from different places. So we've stopped this in mycology, but it meant that you have, say, 100 people in an audience, 4 or 5 from big institutions will put their hands up, 60 votes. And this is a bit of a major flaw in the botanical nomenclature system, so we've got rid of that now for mycology. But that was the reason that didn't get through in St. Louis. It's not the individual hands that go up, it's how many votes each hand counts for. So it's a very unfortunate, though, but they're just behind the times, I'm afraid.
Thank you once again.
Yeah, cheers.